get DMs from both sides who will say, oh, like, why are you in China? Go back to your country. Or like, why would you betray your country by going to China? They don't even like people who look like you. Why would you want to learn Chinese? They're out to get us anyway. I think my role in that sometimes is just to dissolve that ideology. It is important that there are people who are taking their cross-cultural knowledge, blending it together, and giving it to people in ways that are digestible and not just what they're reading in some media outlet.
How did you get into studying Chinese?
One of the great things about living in New York is that you are exposed to a lot of different people from sundry backgrounds from when you're young. In middle school even, I was around a lot of people who had different ethnic backgrounds than I did. And so I gravitated a lot toward Chinese culture. I always was a person who was interested in learning foreign languages, and I gravitated toward Chinese a lot. I actually took Korean when I was in high school, like formally, and I did Mandarin on the side. And I studied for 4 years when I was in high school on my own. And then when I went to college, I majored in Chinese. So I spent a summer in Taipei, and then I spent 6 months in Nanjing and 6 months in Shanghai, respectively, when I was in undergrad. So I've always had somewhat of an affinity for Chinese culture, I think, just because of the environment that I went to school in, who my friends were, and just naturally what I gravitated toward when I was an adolescent.
What is the impact of student exchange between the U.S. and China?
It's very important because you haven't necessarily been extremely exposed to the world. You're still forming your perceptions of the world. That is a very critical juncture and very critical time to go to a foreign country, to really see how other people live, to really see maybe that some of your assumptions of a different place are wrong. I went to China and realized, wow, a lot of what I thought about China actually was wrong or was misinformed. And having that experience, I think, is invaluable in any student's life. And this is not only relative to U.S.-China relations. I think this is even on a macro level is very important for going to any country.
What surprised you about China?
I think there are probably actually two things that surprised me when I went to China. The first would just be convenience and just how easy it was to exist, for lack of a better word. So there were a lot of conveniences that I had in China that I really grew to appreciate and really grew to love in some ways. And the most ostensible, easy one is to say the Waimai, the delivery. But of course, there are many other things in that. High-speed rail is really developed in China, so it was nice to be able to travel all throughout the country and see different parts of China that I never had the opportunity to see or that I had only read about in textbooks, for example. So I think that's one of the things that shocked me the most. The second thing that I would say is the plurality. I think a lot of people who don't go abroad do look at the world in very black and white ways, which is to say that these people are X or those people are Y or these people think this way because they're from a certain country or hold a certain belief, which I don't think that I was actively engaged in that way of thinking when I was in college because I was interested in other cultures. But I do think that at least on a subconscious level, there were some ideas that I maybe thought like, oh, maybe Chinese people by and large will hold certain types of viewpoints, right? I found that not to be the case when I went there. Obviously, I think that has a lot to do with where you are in the country. It has a lot to do with how big the city you're living in is. I definitely see that there is a huge difference between living in, for example, a city like Beijing or Shanghai, which are these very cosmopolitan international metropolises, and then living in much smaller cities like Nanjing, for example, which saying Nanjing is small is a crazy statement to make because it's about the same size as New York, but relative to China or Chinese cities, it is a relatively small city.
What pushback did you receive for trying to study abroad in China?
I was fortunate that my dad, for example, was always very supportive of me going abroad. I'm an only child and I'm from New York City, so my dad was very open. Like I was taking the train by myself when I was like 12, as a lot of New Yorkers do. And so my dad was always very kind of hands off with me in that way. If you want to go somewhere, go. The first time I ever went abroad was when I was in high school, for example, and my dad was like, I feel safer with you being there than I do with you being here. I'm thankful that, at least from my immediate family, there was never any pushback. I have, in some conversations and in some interactions with people, have had people make somewhat snide remarks. Why would you ever go to China? What's there that's not here? One of the comments that I get somewhat often is, oh, they don't even like people who look like you in China, so why would you ever want to go there? It's very easy to hold an opinion of a place you've never been to hold an opinion of people with whom you've never communicated. I think my role in that sometimes is just to kind of dissolve that ideology. I just try to approach it with an open mind because really I actually don't think that these people or these opinions are malicious in their essence. I think that it is the result of media by and large.
When did you start making content on social media?
Content creation is something that I've been interested in for quite a long time. I think at least 8 years. I was always interested in telling stories either via video or via static images. So I was posting content on a lot of different social media platforms and nothing really ever came of it. And then TikTok came out of nowhere and I found myself in quite a unique position being one of the few foreign American students in China during the pandemic. And I just thought that that experience was something that I knew so few people would ever be able to experience that I felt it necessary to share that with the rest of the world. So took to TikTok and got on my phone and just started recording videos of my everyday life when I was at Tsinghua, the process of going to a COVID testing clinic or just showing what exactly was going on in China during that period. So it's been almost exactly 3 years since I started making content. And that's kind of how I made my foray into, I would say, the social media landscape at large.
Can social media serve as a bridge between the U.S. and China?
So I think the function of social media, particularly vis-a-vis, for example, U.S.-China relations, or even on a more micro sense, just having people communicate with each other is enormous. Having the ability to talk to people on both sides of the aisle, so obviously understanding American culture and all of the things that go with American culture, and then having a deep understanding of Chinese culture as well, I'm really able to see things from both sides. And so I think social media is truly that avenue for me to be able to tap into and reach and touch both of those types of people, both of those communities, and both of those worlds, because they are really very different worlds, for lack of a better word. Social media as a vehicle, I think, really is one of the best avenues that we have for dissolving cultural biases or reducing language barriers, for example, learning English or learning Chinese to get people, especially China and America, Chinese people and American people, to just understand each other a bit better.
What has your experience as a Black content creator in the Chinese language social media space looked like?
Being a Black person in China is itself an act of defiance. And being a Black person who makes content about China is by nature inflammatory, I would argue. So I'm used to getting comments all the time, especially, as someone who tries to be as quote unquote objective in my comment as possible. So, I talk about positive experiences I've had in China, not so positive experiences I've had in China, neutral experiences I've had in China, or what I would say are neutral experiences, and I like people to come to their own conclusions about things, right? But I'm also acutely aware that as a Black person in this space, and there are not many of us, by the way, you are always a target in some way, right? And I don't mean that in a necessarily negative way. You are a target of people's adoration and their scorn at the same time. I have a lot of people who love the fact that I learned Chinese, and I have people who message me and say, wow, you're inspiring me to continue my journey of learning Mandarin, or of learning any language for that matter, or you're the reason that I decided to study abroad in college, or you're the reason I decided to take this job in, I don't know, Shanghai, for example. And those comments are always great. Humans have a propensity, though, to focus on negative things. I'll get DMs from both sides of the aisle who will say, oh, like, why are you in China? Go back to your country. Or like, no one wants you here. Or I don't understand why you, as a Black person, would like demoralize yourself by going to a country where no one likes you. Or prostrating yourself to a country that doesn't like you, just by virtue of the fact that you are dark-skinned. I've learned to not really let it get to me that much. If I let every one of those comments get to me, it'd be death by a bunch of staple wounds. It would be erroneous of me to say that there aren't some negative perceptions that some people in China do hold about Black people. But at the same time, it would also be erroneous of me to say that the perceptions that some people here in America have of China are all correct, right? I entered this space making content about Chinese and China and Asia at large, knowing that it is essentially an inflammatory thing to do and that it's an avenue that will ruffle some feathers. I think that what keeps me going sometimes is just knowing that this needs to be shared, and these experiences are not very common, and it is important that there are people who are taking their cross-cultural knowledge, blending it together, and giving it to people in ways that are digestible and not just what they're reading in some media outlet, because the media outlet just wants you to click, right? I want you to click too, but I also want you to take something away from the video that maybe you wouldn't have before, or maybe have something to gnaw on that maybe it wasn't presented to you in another medium or another format.
What are common misunderstandings that Americans and Chinese people have of each other?
When it comes to misunderstandings, naturally people will look at people who come from different backgrounds than them as somewhat different than they are, just because they are. Maybe they don't speak the same language as you, or they don't have the same cultural values as you, or they don't eat the same things as you do. There are just a lot of incongruencies, right? And that's natural between any culture, and especially cultures that are as disparate as American culture and Chinese culture. I think that one of the things that American people sometimes misunderstand about China is they will sometimes think that all Chinese people are the same. So, for example, sometimes American people will think that all Chinese people, like, they eat the same thing, or they hold the same political views, or, for example, they think the same way about America, right? Which is just not true, right? It's not a true statement. Just as not all American people feel the same way about China, or feel the same way about Chinese food, or Chinese culture, or Chinese people in general, right? There is going to be a plurality in any culture in any country that you go to. So I think that that may be one of the biggest misunderstandings, is just this sense of a binary where it's either black or it's white, and there's not really much of a gray area. There are a lot of people in America who think that everything that happens in China or relative to China is just bad. It's a very monolithic way of looking at the world, to think that anything that any given country does, or by consequence of that, the people of that country are tangentially related to, is bad, right? Because it's impossible for that to be the case. I've had a lot of conversations with people in America who will just go toe-to-toe with me and just say, why would you betray your country by going to China? Why would you want to learn Chinese? Like, what's that going to do for you? They're out to get us anyway. A lot of people aren't engaged in this interrogation process of why they hold certain beliefs. Once you discover why you hold certain beliefs, you can begin to see, oh, well, does this make sense logically, right? Like, does this make sense? Sometimes you'll find that it doesn't make sense, right? So that's on the American side. Now, obviously, on the Chinese side, I've also had, as a person who is black or is American, I've had quite a few Chinese people say things to me to the effect of, everything that China does is always good, or China's never done anything wrong, or everything bad that happens is because of America. And it's very difficult to reason with these types of people, because if you are entering this exchange that we're having with these very doctrinaire perspectives, where no matter what I say to you, we're not getting anywhere, right? I have had some less than palatable experiences in cabs, even in Beijing, or just talking to regular people in Beijing, where people are telling me that I should go back to where I came from, or that, you know, America is the reason that they don't like their life, right? Or that I am in some way culpable for the misfortunes that they have encountered in their lives. And it's impossible to reason with people like that. I try to be as kind about it as possible and say, you know, well, America is certainly not a perfect place. I mean, whew, Lord. But it would also be erroneous to say that everything that America does is bad on a geopolitical level. So I would say that the thing that tends to be a difficulty when it comes to both sides of the aisle is really getting people to question if what they believe makes sense, and where are you getting your information from, right? Like, if you're only getting your information from one source, it's a little difficult to challenge that, right? To say, well, maybe this is wrong. Maybe I should think about this in a different way. Maybe the way that someone taught me, maybe what they taught me was wrong.